Hello and welcome to Woodworks. My name's Robert Wilson and I'll be your host. Today's show we're going to build an oversized coffee table. It's going to be 3 foot on each side, so it'll be 3 foot square. And we're going to be making it out of cherry and walnut. The general design for the table is I'm going to make a top that has 4 pieces to it coming together in kind of a diamond shape. To give you an idea, here's another table that's in the room, and the top on this table, if you can see the top on it right, it has 4 pieces diagonally, so the grain on each piece is running to make almost like a square shape with the grain. Now in order to match this table, this one's out of cherry. In order to keep the same similar design, we're going to be doing the top on this coffee table the same way. The legs for the table, we're going to turn those, and what I have is walnut stock, and there's 4 pieces of walnut here that I've already glued up. Now we still need to plane it down and true up the sides a little bit, getting it to the exact size, and each one of these I've got 2 pieces like this, and each one of these will be cut in half and make 2 legs. As you can see, the legs are going to be about 3.5 by 3.5 inches, so they're going to be pretty substantial. Now the legs and the trim on the top of the around the top of the table will be walnut. The rest of the actual top of the table and the support braces for the legs will be out of cherry. Now, as you can see in front of me, I've got a sheet of cherry plywood, and I've already marked off 3 of the triangular pieces that need to be cut to make the top. Now, you want to be real careful when you're working with the cabinet grade plywood like this. This is 3/4 inch thick cherry plywood, and it's a VC plywood, which stands for veneer core. You can either get a veneered core plywood, or you can get a what's called MDF core, which is like a compressed cardboard. Both are good for something like a tabletop or general cabinets. I like to use the veneer core most of the time. Now if you're going to build a speaker cabinet or something like that, you want to use the MDF core. The MDF is a little bit cheaper than the veneer core, but I like it a little bit better. I think it holds up a little better in the long run. And so when you're dealing with a sheet like this, you want to mark off everything, measure it very carefully, because the plywood can get pretty expensive. The sheet of plain birch 3/4 inch plywood probably run you around $50 a sheet. Getting up into some of the sheets like cherry or mahogany or walnut, they can range anywhere from $80 on up to $120 for one sheet. So you want to be real careful with the wood, and because one little mistake on it can be very expensive. So what I've done here is I've marked off 3 of the triangles that I'm going to cut out. I haven't marked off all 4. I'm going to show you why I haven't marked off the 4th triangle. It's a little trick I found when I was building the other table. Everything's been measured real carefully, and what I'm going to do, obviously in cutting a big piece of plywood like this, and with only having one person, and even if you have a couple people, it's hard unless you have a large table saw set up for cutting big sheets of plywood. It's pretty awkward. So what I've always found works best is my work table. I flip it over and I use one side as a cut side. It has little cuts going all through it because that's where I cut the plywood on. And when I'm done with that, I'll flip it back over and the other side's still nice and smooth. Now what I do is, to cut a big sheet of plywood like this, I'll use my circular saw, and I'll set up just a board on here as a guide fence to cut the lines. Now a little trick, and it's pretty important, gives you nice, in order to use that fence properly and give you a accurate straight cut and an accurate cut right on the line that you want, what I found is take your circular saw and take 2 pieces of wood and attach them together like this. Now this acts as, and this is just nailed on here, make sure that it is perpendicular to this board here, and nail it on there. And then what you want to do is, there's basically two ways you can run your circular saw using a rip fence. You can either run it with this edge of the saw right here against your fence. So what you want to do is make a cut up this board a little way. Don't cut all the way through. Raise your blade up a little bit and make a cut here. Now then, turn it around, and once again, using this side as against the fence, make another small cut. Now, most of your saw blades are about 1/8 of an inch wide. I've got a thin kerf blade on here, and it's less than 1/8 of an inch wide. It's about 3/32 of an inch, and so then what you do is, after you make these cuts, take your ruler, put it against that fence, and what you want to do is measure to the inside part of the cut and mark down exactly what that distance is. On this one it's 1.5 inches, and then to the outside, on the other side of that cut, is 1 19/32 of an inch. Now you want to do that with this one and with this other cut. Now with a ruler you can check to get an exact measurement. Sometimes it might not fall exactly right based on the English measurements as far as an inch. You may want to go look at your metrics and see, you might get a better measurement there, such as on this side of the further cut, it's exactly 12 8/10 of a centimeter from here. Now the other side is exactly 5 1/8 of an inch. So it doesn't matter what you use as long as you have an accurate and exact measurement. So now what you can do is, and this I just keep it laying around your shop, that way whenever you do, you don't have to memorize that. You can just pull it out, look at it, and that way it lets you decide which way, if you want to put your fence on this side of the cut or on this side of the cut, and which way is easiest to hold your saw when you're making these cuts. So what I'm going to do now is get the fences set up on here and get these 3 pieces cut out, and we'll go on to the next step. Okay, I've got 3 of the 4 triangle pieces for the top cut out. What we need to do now is glue these 3 together. Actually, I'm going to glue 2 of them up first. Once it dries, I'll glue the third one in place. And there's several ways that you can support the seam, which needs to be done. You can either use biscuits in there. You can also use a spline technique, which is cutting a thin groove down each edge that's going to be joined and then putting a thin piece of wood in there to support it. Or what I'm going to use is, I'm going to use some dowels in there. Reason for that is I've got a jig that will line up the holes dead center of the stock that I'm going to be drilling into. Makes it a whole lot easier. This board here, I already have 4 holes drilled and it's ready to go. And what I've done was, I've had this piece lined up with this one and just made 4 marks across it, evenly spaced across the seam onto each piece, and then you line the jig up with it and drill the hole. What I'll do now is show how that jig works in drilling these holes. Okay, this is the jig that I'm going to use, and how it works is, there's different size holes along this size depending on the size dowel that you're going to be using. We're going to be using a 3/16 inch dowel, so we're going to use the small hole here. Now how this works is, you put it on the work surface and then you clamp it down, and what the screw does is it brings both sides in at the same rate, so that it automatically aligns the hole you're going to be drilling into the center of the workpiece, no matter how thick the material is. So what I've done is, there's a little mark inside here. I line that up with the mark that I have. Then you take your drill, get the bit in there. Okay, I drilled that hole. I've set it for about 5/8 of an inch deep. That should be sufficient to support the whole side. And all you do is slide down to your next mark, tighten the jig back up, and drill your next hole. Okay, we've got all the holes drilled, and now we're ready to cut the dowels. And a quick little shop tip for you: before you cut your dowel lengths, which I'm going to cut these a little over an inch long, is take the dowel and drag it across a saw. Now, by dragging it across the saw blades like this, what you're going to do is make tiny grooves in the dowel rod. And if you've ever bought dowel pegs before to glue a piece up like this, you'll notice they've got grooves in it. Now what that's for is you want to get a little bit of glue in there, but if your fit is too tight, there's nowhere for that glue to go, and it makes it real hard to clamp the piece together. So by putting those little bit of grooves in there by dragging it across the saw blade, then what you've done is allowed that glue a place to escape as you clamp the piece together. And as you may have, you've probably already noticed this or thought of it, is what we need to do is clamp these two pieces together. Now that's going to be difficult to do since we don't have two parallel sides. So what I've done is I've made a series of these little blocks. Now what they are is there's a square piece, and then it has a triangular piece attached to the face of it, and I've just screwed that on there. And then what I'm going to do is on the back side or the underside of the tabletop, I'm going to screw these in place. And what this will do is by putting one, I'm going to put a series of these on here. I've got 4 of them total. So I'm going to put 2 up towards this end, and then I'm going to put 2 towards the back end. Now what this will do is allow parallel surfaces so that I can put bar clamps on this so that I can clamp these two pieces together. Now before you now I've got these all lined up, and so I can go ahead and drop a few screws in here. Make sure that the screws you're using aren't gonna come through the other side of the board, because that'll ruin the top of it for you. So what you want to do is make sure the diagonal edge is secure against the edge of the board, then just go ahead and screw it in place. You can do that with all 3 of them, and then we'll pull it back apart. I've put the dowels in here to check to make sure that everything lines up the way I want it to. Looks like a good snug fit, so I'm going to glue the rest of these, or screw the rest of these down, and then we'll clamp it up and move on to the next step. Okay, when we're gluing this up, I've got the dowels in here with a little bit of glue on there. On this seam here, you want to spread a nice even coat of glue. You're going to get just a little bit of squeeze out when you glue this up. Then what you want to do is get the pieces in position, and sometimes you have to work with it a little bit to get all your dowels going in at just the same time. Kind of work it back and forth a little bit. Okay, then once you have them all into position, bring it in, and you want to check your top and bottom, make sure that everything's level and where you want it. Now what I'm going to do is put a couple pipe clamps on here. Remember, we're using these to clamp this up, using our brace pieces that we made to pull it all together. So now once I have the pipe clamps in place, now what we'll do is we'll tighten this down, we'll let this dry overnight, and we'll come back and get the 3rd piece in place, and we'll show you what we're going to do with the 4th piece that we still have to cut. Okay, as you can see now, we have 3 of the pieces are glued together. We still have to do the fourth side, and like I said earlier, there's a little trick to doing this. I've done several tops to tables and different things using this type of design for the top, and the thing I've always found is that no matter how much time you put into precisely cutting the angles right, once you've got 3 of them glued up, that last piece to go in place, you'll always find that it may be just this last angle, it might be a little bit just a tad over 90 degrees or a little bit under 90 degrees, and so you end up with a piece that you've either got to try to trim to fit just right, or you've got to cut another piece because it's just a little bit too loose. So what I found works best is go ahead and do 3 pieces, put them together, get them glued up so you know, they're not going to move anymore, they're right where you want them to be. And then what you do is use this opening as your template for your last piece. Now I've measured this with a square, and this has actually come out pretty close to being just right. It's about the closest that I've ever gotten it before, but it's still, what I want to do is just take the piece of wood you're going to be cutting out, lay down the top piece, lay it down on top, and then just take a pencil, and what we're going to do is draw a line down each side. So now what you have on here is an exact layout of the piece you want to fit in here. So what we'll do is move this out of the way, and we'll cut this piece out and we'll get it glued into place. As you saw, we cut out the final piece to fit into place, and the last thing we showed was using a slot cutting bit on the router to cut little notches, slots in the edges of the board. In case you're wondering, since this final piece here is going to have to slide in at an angle, we're not going to be able to use dowel rods to support the piece in place. So what we did was we cut little slots in the sides of the board here, and what we'll do is slide biscuits into those slots. That way, when we do get the piece glued into place, it'll be able to slide into place the way it needs to fit, and will still be supported. Personally, I think the dowel rods will give a little bit more support, but since we're not able to use those here, we're going to switch over and use biscuits on the final piece. So we're going to get this glued up, and then it'll be time to start on the legs. Okay, we've got the tabletop. It's all glued up now, and it's ready to go. As you can see, I used 3 clamps across it. We didn't have to use any sort of a special jig on it since it's supported on 3 of the sides. So we're able to just put the 3 clamps across here and pull it in. Something else I did after I glued it up was I took a rag and some water, wiped down the whole top, and I did that for a couple reasons. First, I wanted to get all of the glue that squeezed out from the joints when I tightened it up. I wanted to get all that off of the top so that it doesn't inhibit the stain when we stain it later from soaking into the wood. So we did that, and then the other thing is I wanted to get the whole top surface wet in order to raise the grain a little bit, and once I do that, then we can go back over it, give it a light sanding, and it'll give us a smoother finish later on when we put the stain and finish on it. So, oh, there's the phone. Hang on just a second. All right, Norm. Yeah, no problem. You're welcome. Bye-bye. Ladies and gentlemen, that was our first guest phone call. Your buddy and mine, good old Norm. You know, I love him to death, but I'll tell you what. You know, think twice before you give that man your phone number. Because I'll tell you, he'll just call and worry you to death. And super nice guy. Love him to death. And I'll rip on him from time to time, but he's a good guy. And like, you know, I was telling him, you know, he said, should I use the tongue and groove or the dovetail joint? And, you know, I had to tell him, I said, Norm, you know, you got to use the dovetail joint. It's a prettier joint. It's a sign of quality. You know, it's more sturdy. It's going to last longer, a lot more durable. So go for the dovetail joint, and then I'll tell you what. Take your brad nailer, shoot a few brads into a scrap piece of wood, because that's what it is. He doesn't like the dovetail joint because he can't use his brad nailer. So told him use the dovetail joint, shoot a few brads into a scrap piece of wood. That way you're happy, you feel good, you got to use the extra tools. So, but that was nice call from Norm. Said to say hi. See if we can't get him on the show sometime. Anyways, where were we at? We're just finishing up talking about the tabletop here. Let it finish drying up before we can go on with it. And now we're ready to start working on the legs for the table. Now what I've got here is the walnut stock is glued up and ready to go. What we need to do now is get the wood squared up and get it ready to turn. Okay, the first thing that we want to do in getting the leg ready is where we've glued it up, and there's a little bit of squeeze out between the boards on here, and that will damage your planer and joiner blade. So what you want to do is, I just use a pull scraper and just take that, and you want to run that down the board on both sides to get out any of the little beads of glue. Just knock those off. Now the glue that's in between the wood is not going to damage your blades, but those little beads that you get on the top will, and they can also make it difficult as far as making sure that you have the piece lined up exactly the way you want it and throw it off of being square. So now that we've done that, we'll go to the joiner. What I'm going to use is I've got one flat side of the board, and then I've got the two, I've got the ends that are the rough edges that we really want to smooth up. We've got two sides that are parallel, and we want to get the perpendicular sides nice and flat and get it to the exact size we want. So what we'll show is using the joiner to clean off the edges, and also then running the legs through the planer to get them down to the exact size we want. Okay, as you saw, we finished joining and planing the legs, and after that what we've done is I've cut them to length, make these 15.5 inches long, and then using a ruler I made a cross on each end of the wood and made the indentations to fit the wood into the lathe. Now this next step of turning the legs is purely decorative. There's no need to turn them. If you wanted to leave them square and just sand them up and go ahead and use them that way, you can. There's no real structural purpose to it other than it's just purely aesthetic to make it look nicer. So what I'm going to use, I happen to have a copy attachment on my lathe, which makes it a little easier to make all four legs exactly the same. And how this works is this piece here rides on the template, which you can see right here in the back. And what happens is, as the wood turns here, you have to manually rotate this, which moves your copier down, and there's a little pin back there that, as you can see, it will lower itself following the pattern that you have in the back. And then it comes back up, and you turn this all the way down, making the passes as your piece spins. Now this is a very slow going process because you can't go from your square stock down to your finished product in one pass. What you want to do is take off about 1/8 of an inch at each pass. So in order to get this leg down to the finished product, we're probably going to have to make 9 or 10 passes. And so what I'm going to do is go ahead and get started on this. Something that you do want to do also when you're using walnut, the dust and shavings from it is a little more harmful than a lot of wood, so always make sure that you do wear a respirator. That way 20 years from now you won't regret it. And when you first start up your lathe, you want to start it up at a real slow speed. Then once you get it rounded up, you can go ahead and start spinning it a little bit faster. So I'll show you how this works, and we'll get all 4 of our legs turned. Okay, we've got all 4 legs turned, as you can see. Now, what you want to do now is take a look at the legs and look at each one closely, check out where it has any blemishes on it or things that you may want to try to conceal. And what you want to do now is set them up how you want those legs to be on the bottom of your table. For example, on this leg, we're going to put this knot towards the inside, so I'm going to want that leg to sit like this. And then what you do is, once you have all 4 legs all sitting how you want them to sit, what you do is turn it over, and you need to make 2 marks on each leg. Okay, now what that is showing is these 2 sides I've marked on this leg, I've marked these 2 sides on this one, these 2, and these 2. Now what we're going to do next is we're going to cut a 1/4 of an inch deep groove about 3.5 inches up on both those sides. Now it's going to be right in the center, and what that groove is going to be for is the rails that will connect the legs and support the legs, and because we're going to do a tongue and groove on those. And so like I said, we've marked all 4 of the legs. Now we're going to use the router. It's already set up, and you'll see that it has a stop block on it, so that as we slide the leg up and cut it, it won't cut any further up than what we need it to. So we'll go ahead and do all 4 legs, and then it'll be time to get back to work on the top of the table. We're all done with the legs for the moment. We don't need to do, we won't need those until we get ready to assemble the table. What we need to do now is go back to the top, which is all dry for the main pieces. What we have to do now though is put the trim around the top edge. Now what we're going to use is I've got some 1.5 inch wide walnut that we're going to put around the edge. The top, the rest of the top is cherry, so we're going to trim it in walnut, and I've got it cut 1.5 inches wide, and we're mitering the ends of it. And then also, as you can see, we've got 3 holes drilled in the trim piece. We're going to use dowel rods again on this to attach it, and the dowel rods give you 2 things. One, it'll add the additional support for that lip in case people are putting their feet up on the table, or little kids or whatever putting pressure on it. In addition, when you're gluing it up, this will help line up the wood even with the top, so you don't have too much of an edge for sanding off or too high or too low. So what we'll do is first get the dowel rods put in place. Okay, we want to get the dowel rods in place here. I've got 2 in place, and to show you another trick before you put a dowel rod in, you can get a little cheap pencil sharpener, give a few turns on each end of the dowel rod, and so what you do is you get a little bit of a point to it. That helps when putting the dowel rods in place and when you go to line the dowel rods up when we go to glue this. If you leave it square, a lot of times that can make it difficult in trying to get all 3 of the dowel rods in place at the same time. Now what we'll do is get some glue on here. Okay, and just use your finger, spread it out a little bit. Or if you don't want to get your finger or hands dirty, you can use a little brush or something, but typically with if you're going to be doing a lot of gluing up, you can go through a lot of brushes doing that, so I find it's easier just to keep something with a little bit of water and a rag in it there. Clean your hands off. Now I'm going to take the piece, start it into position. Okay, you probably won't be able to slide it all the way in. So then you want to use your clamps. Just starting to tighten each one a little bit. Now if you don't have any bar clamps or pipe clamps and you're going to get some, I recommend getting the 3/4 inch pipe clamps as opposed to the 1/2 inch, because if you're going to end up gluing up anything that's more than a foot or 2 long, you'll find the 3/4 inch pipe clamps will bow a lot less and will give you more strength when you're tightening them down. Okay, now you want to kind of evenly tighten these as you're going along. Okay, and as you see, we've got just a little bit of squeeze out here. So what we're going to do then is use our rag, get most of the water out of it here. The glue I'm using is can be cleaned up using water, so use a wet rag. You just want to wipe along the edge of that and get all that glue up, so that way you won't have any problems here in a little bit when we go to put the stain on it. Just go ahead and clean that edge up. Okay, now we're going to let this leave this clamped up, let it dry, and we'll go on to we're going to put a little more trim on the bottom, and we'll start working on that next. Okay, as you can see, we just finished cutting our trim, the molding that we're going to put on the underside of the table. As you can see, we're using a pretty large bit. This is a multi-profile bit that you can make a lot of different edges and decorative moldings with it. It is a very large bit, so as you saw, we made with that particular profile we made, we had to make 2 passes with it. One pass would have removed too much wood and can be dangerous, and not to mention it'll also give you a poor finish. So if you're making some real deep cuts or anything like that where you're going to be removing a lot of wood, you're going to want to make several passes with it. Now what we've done is, before we can put this molding onto the table, what we have to do is put our decorative edge around the edge of the table. So what I've done, since our tabletop is so large, it's easier to use the router freehand and run it along the edge. Now we're going to use the same bit, but I've adjusted it to get another different profile with it. And what this is going to give us is what's called a bead bit. It's just basically a half circle and gives a little bit of an edge on the top and bottom of it. What I've also done is hooked up a guide fence to keep the bit so it doesn't cut too far into the wood. It's kind of hard to give you a good angle of showing it actually cutting, so I'll kind of show you what you go through in setting this up and starting to make the cuts. Okay, you saw how we put the edge on the table here. Now I do want to warn you, if you're not comfortable using a router, if you haven't had a lot of experience, putting that edge on there like that is pretty dangerous, and it's also fairly awkward. So if you're not real comfortable using your router that way, either use a smaller bit, one that has the ball bearing guide on it, which you don't have, so that you won't have to put the fence on the router base and do that. And two, the router I have is a little bit larger and a little heavier than most that's what's out there, and so that makes it a little bit more awkward also. So I just want to give you a little word of caution there. As you see now, we're putting the trim around the additional trim around the bottom of the table. I've got 3 of the sides on there. What I've done is miter cut the edges, and so we're ready to put the 4th piece on here. And this is just going to, it's mostly decorative. This will add a little bit of strength to the piece. It will also, it'll be used to support the outside edges of the legs, which I'll show you in just a second. What I'll do is just put a little bit of glue on here, and go ahead and slide this in place. Like I said, I've already miter cut the corners on this, and this is nice. I mean, it's not going to be real visible, so you don't have to be super precise with it. Now I'm going to cheat a little bit here and go ahead and throw a few brad nails in it. Now these, I don't like to rely on the brad nails for actually giving any real strength to a piece, but they do come in handy when you're putting molding on, such as this. And two, the brad nails are not going to be seen. So I like to use them on here, just it holds it in place real quick, gives the glue a chance to dry without having to put a bunch of clamps on it and stuff. Does make things a little easier. Now what we're going to do now is, see, the legs will fit right into these corners like that, so that'll give some additional support to the legs. We'll then have the rails which will connect the legs, and as we already showed, we've already put the groove in the legs so that those rails will actually go into those grooves, and so this should make it a very sturdy table. Then once we have the rails in place, we'll probably put a cross type bracing underneath. Since it is such a large table, you always run the risk of little kids climbing on it, or you're going to stand on it to change the light bulb or something. So we will support it, especially since it is in 4 different pieces. We want to make sure that all of our seams are well supported. So we're going to let this dry overnight, and next thing we will do is get onto the rails, and we'll be about done. Okay, what I've done now is I've cut 4 pieces of cherry plywood. They're about 4 1/4 inches wide, and we're going to use these for the rails on the table. Now what we've got to do is the bottom side of the piece of wood where it'll be exposed towards the underside of the towards the floor, we need to put a piece of edge banding on there in order to make it look like a solid piece of wood. So what we're going to do is I'm going to give you a crash course on edge banding, which is really about all it'll take, because edge banding is really a pretty easy procedure. This is cherry edge banding. It's a little over 3/4 of an inch wide, and you can buy it in rolls, you can buy it in strips, you can buy it in different widths. What you want to do is first get you a piece that's just a little bit, actually there's a little seam in here. I'm going to cut that out. Start with a fresh piece. What you want to do is first get a piece of the edge banding, just a little bit longer than the piece you're going to apply it to. I like to use an old Swiss Army pocket knife that has the scissors on it. Works just right for trimming the edge banding. Now, I want to kind of just hold it in place, and it's going to stick over a little bit on each edge. Now you want that to stick over because after you've applied the edge banding, you're going to trim those little bits on the edges off. Now, I like to use, I've got an old, my old college iron, and you want to use that. Don't go in and get the good iron from the house, or probably be in a whole lot of trouble. Now what you want to do is just run it down over the edge banding real quick. That'll kind of get it to stick in place. As you see, I've got a little block of wood, because this the edge banding has glue on the other side of it, which is heat activated, and so as I run the iron over it, it melts that glue, and it does get it very hot. So you want to use a block of wood or something to press it down onto the wood, otherwise you'll burn yourself. So now that you got it down, you just want to run that block back and forth over it a few times, and then what I'll do is, you don't want to angle this a whole lot, but I like to angle it just a little bit and push down on each edge. What that does is gives you a nice tight seam on your board. Okay, now that's about all there is to applying the edge banding. Now we can trim off the edges a little bit, and then we'll use, what I like to do is use a just plain old putty knife that I've sharpened it a little bit, so it's got a little bit of a sharp edge on it here, and we'll use that to trim off the excess. Okay, so now with, as you can see, just the little edge here, and what we'll do is take the putty knife, and all you do is slide it along the wood here, and you'll trim that little bit that was sticking up, and trim that off of there. And what you're left with is just a small amount of, you see a little bit of glue edge there. And what you do is then you can sand that real lightly. And that little glue edge there should pretty much disappear to what you're left with is a nice piece of wood that looks like a solid piece of cherry. Now this is what we're going to use for the rails, and we'll show gluing the table up now, and we'll get on to finishing it. Okay, we've got all of the rails cut, and I've notched little grooves in them so that they'll fit into the grooves on the legs properly. I've dry fitted it all together to make sure that it will fit properly, and now what I've done is disassembled it, but I like to try to lay everything out so that as it's been dry fitted together, that everything, once we glue it up and put it back together, is exactly the same as when it was dry fitted. So you can see I've got everything set up here, and we're ready to start gluing the table up. So something else I've done is when I had it all dry fitted together, I took a pencil and made lines around the inside edges of all of the boards so that I've got some lines marked on the underside of the table here, which will help in putting down all of the glue lines for the legs. So what I'm going to do now is spread some glue, and this will be on the underside of the table, so you don't have to be quite as neat about it as with some of the top pieces, because if there's a little too much squeeze out from the glue, it's not going to be seen, so it doesn't really matter that much. Go ahead and put a little bit inside the grooves on the legs. Now you need to decide which direction you're going to go with this, because I think I'm going to go around to the right, so I'm going to go ahead and put a little bit of glue in this groove also on that side, so we'll be ready to go. Now what I'm going to do is simply slide that into place, get this leg into place, drop it down in, and there's a little bit of squeeze out coming on this side. That's fine, the way we want it to be. Then what we're going to do is just move around to the next side of the table. Keep spreading more glue. And we're just going to keep going around and get the other sides done. And then after, while I'm waiting for this glue to dry, what I'm going to work on is the all of the trim that we have on the edge of the table here. All of this trim here all needs to be sanded, and there's a few little gaps in the corners and stuff. We'll use some wood filler, fill those in, and start sanding that. Then what we're going to do is I'm going to flip it over, sand the top of it real good, and I'm going to use some wood filler that can be watered down a little bit. Fill that over the top, and that'll fill the grain on it, and sand it a little bit more. Then we'll stain and finish it. Okay, something else that I'd said I was going to do earlier, and wanted to show you here, is I'm going to put cross braces on the underside of this table. So give it some extra strength and support for in case any real heavy weight gets applied to the top. So what I've done is I've cut two pieces that are I've notched them, so what we can do, and they're 3 inches in width, so they're not quite as high as, there we go, they're not quite as high as the side pieces. That way they're not going to be quite as visible. And as you can see, I notched them so that they'll fit together. Now what we're going to do is, as you see, I've already applied the glue in place. It's been kind of messy as far as the glue goes because I'm not too concerned about it being seen, and I want to make sure that I have plenty of it under there. Okay. Now I had, like I'd said before, I had taken a pencil and made lines on here to see, so I knew exactly where these braces were to go ahead of time. So now we've got the braces in place. Got some of that extra glue there. You can take your finger, kind of spread it along the edges, make sure you got lots of it in there to hold everything in place. So this will give the table a lot more support as far as any additional weight being applied to the top, and overall just make it a lot more sturdy. So now we're ready to go on and do the staining and finishing. Okay, as you can see, we are working on filling the wood now. I'm working on the walnut trim first. What I've done is mixed up the filler, thinned it down. I'm just using a spatula, and what you want to do is try to get right up to the edge and pull it across the grain. That's going to force the filler down into the open parts of the grain. And what I'll do is first I'll do the walnut trim, let it dry, and then I'll do the cherry in the center. And once it's all filled and dried, then I'll go back over and sand it off. Now I'm only going to fill the wood on the top of the table. This is obviously the part that's going to be most visible on the table. The legs and the lower parts of the table are not as critical. This is where your prime finish is going to be. If you have, the part you really want to focus on is the top. The lower portions of the table are a little less critical. They're not as seen. They're not going to get as much light reflecting off of them. But we're going to go ahead and finish doing the walnut here, and depending on how it sands off, we may need to put another coat on it, the filler, and sand it down. I'll just have to wait and see. Okay, as you see, we now have the finished table here. We showed you filling in the wood grain, and we sanded it down real good, and then as you saw, we turned the table upside down, sprayed the legs and the rails on it first. Once that dried, we flipped it back over, and as you saw, we put some newspaper to cover the legs. That helps keep the overspray off of the legs, so it's a little bit less polishing when you're all done. We sprayed the top with a couple good coats. Then once the finish dried, I hit it with a real fine rubbing compound, and then hand polished with wax on the top. I'm trying to tilt it up here a little bit for you, let you see what the top looks like now that the finish is on there. It turned out real nice. It's a real, we used a high gloss finish. A lot of your different finishes you can get in what they call different sheen. It may just be listed as a satin or a semi-gloss or a gloss. This finish was a 65 sheen, which is a real high gloss, so you can polish it up to give it a real nice shine. The top has a few more coats, has about 2 more coats than the legs has on it. That'll help it last a little bit longer. And I paid a lot more attention to the top when I was doing the polishing and the final finishing. That's the area that's really going to be seen and noticed by people. You do want to still make the legs smooth, but you don't have to make them quite as nice as the top where everyone's going to see. And that about wraps it up for the show. Hope you've learned something. And other than turning the legs, most of this project can be done with circular saw to cut out the top pieces and then gluing those up. You need a couple of clamps there and a drill if you're going to put the dowel rods in there. You can, if you don't have a jig to drill the holes like we showed in gluing the top up, you can just use a little bit larger bit to give you a little more room to work with when you slide the dowels in there. You can buy legs pre-made to use, so you really can do a project like this with a minimal amount of tools. If you have any questions or comments, our email is... Hope you enjoyed the show. Like I said, if you have any questions or comments, send us an email, get in touch with your local cable station. Thanks a lot. How you doing? This is Robert Wilson. After watching the show that you just watched, and when you design your own furniture, a lot of times after you're done with the project and look at how you designed it in your building process, you'll notice that you'll come across ideas and ways that it could have been improved and done better. This show is with anything else. We'll make mistakes. You'll see things that could be done better. You might have a better way to do it yourself. We're open to tips and ideas, and after watching the show, something hit me that I wanted to share with you. When you saw the top of the table being put together, the 4 pieces that came together, you saw I did 2 pieces together, then I put the 3rd piece on, then I finally did the 4th piece. The 4th piece took some pretty tricky cutting and you had to be real careful so that it would fit precisely in with the other 3, and after watching that, I saw something that would have made the whole process a whole lot easier, and I wanted to share that with you before getting on to another show. And that whole idea is here's 2 scrap pieces of wood. If you make your first half, put 2 pieces together like this so that you've got 1 half, and then put another 2 pieces together the same way. Okay, then what you end up with, you see these lines on here, is you're going to end up with 2 triangles put together, both of those just like this. Now what you can do is run this side through your joiner, giving you a perfectly flat edge. Do the same with this one, and now to get your tabletop, all you have to do is join those 2 pieces of wood together using biscuits, dowels, whatever you decide to use. Make the whole process a whole lot easier than what I had done in building this table. So hindsight is 20/20. I watched the show, and as I was seeing some of the things I did, I realized that this would be a much easier way to put the tabletop together. I wanted to admit my mistake or added difficulty to the project that really didn't need to be there. Right after this, we'll roll the credits, and my email address will be up there if you have any questions or comments or other ideas you have regarding this project or any other projects on the show, things you like or dislike. Let me know. I'll try to incorporate things like that into future shows. Thank you very much.